My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I am 78 years old. People in my town say I live in the quietest house on Maple Road. They say time itself slows down here. I don't know if that's true. But I do know one thing. This house has been waiting with me for a very long time. Every evening, just before the sun begins to fade, I sit by the window with a cup of warm tea in my hands. I always face the road. I have been doing this for 40 years. Some people call it habit. Others call it foolish hope. Colav. My husband, Samuel, walked down that road one rainy evening and promised me he would come back. He didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because he had no other choice. That night is carved into my memory as if it happened yesterday. The air smelled of wet earth, and my heart felt heavier than my body. Samuel was being blamed for something he did not do. The town had already judged him, and no one was willing to listen. "I'll clear my name," he told me, holding my hands so tightly they almost hurt. "And when the truth comes out, I'll return." I watched him walk away until the darkness swallowed his shadow. For years, letters came. Some were hopeful. Some were tired. He wrote about distant places, hard work, and his search for the truth. I kept every letter in a small wooden box under my bed. I read them whenever the nights felt too long. The letters stopped. People began to talk. They told me to move on. They told me he had abandoned me. Some even whispered that maybe he had been guilty all along. I never believed them. Kept Samuel's coat behind the door. I kept his mug on the shelf. Every Sunday, I baked bread the way he liked it, even though no one else was there to eat it with me. Years passed. Decades passed. Children grew up. Faces changed. Seasons came and went. But my heart stayed right there on that road, waiting for a man who had promised to return. And then, one evening, something changed. I had just set my teacup down when I heard it. Slow, careful footsteps outside my house. My heart began to pound so hard I thought it might break my ribs. No one visits me anymore. Then came a knock, soft, almost unsure. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Hope can be cruel to old women like me. Still, my legs carried me to the door. When I opened it, an old man stood there. His hair was white. His shoulders were bent. His face was worn by years I could not imagine. For a second, I felt disappointed, until he looked at me. Those eyes. I had stared into them every night, in my memories. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I finally came home." The world stopped breathing. I wanted to cry. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream his name. But before I could do any of that, I noticed something that made my heart grow cold. Behind his relief, there was fear. Fear. That was the moment I understood something terrible. Samuel had not returned because the past was over. He had returned because it was no longer safe to stay away. I did not let Samuel stand outside for long. My hands moved on their own as I stepped aside and allowed him into the house. The same house he had left for decades ago. The moment he crossed the doorway, he stopped, as if the walls themselves were staring back at him. And as Shanzi said softly, "Thomble," he looked around slowly. His eyes rested on the coat behind the door, the familiar mug on the shelf, the old clock ticking patiently on the wall. His lips pressed together, and I saw his chest rise and fall as if he were holding back years of breath. "You kept everything," he whispered. "I kept my promise," I replied. We sat across from each other at the small wooden table. For a long moment, Neither of us spoke. Silence filled the room, heavy and awkward. Like to strangers pretending not to notice the years between them. Finally, I asked the question that had lived inside me for 40 years. Why did you really disappear, Samuel? He lowered his gaze to his hands. They were rougher now, marked by scars I did not recognize. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost ashamed. I couldn't tell you the truth back then, he said. And I wasn't sure I ever would. My heart tightened. Try, I said. After all this time, I deserve that much. He nodded slowly. He told me that the night he left, he had already discovered something dangerous. The accusation against him was not a mistake, it was deliberate. Someone powerful in our town had used him as a shield to hide their own wrongdoing. When Samuel tried to expose the truth, he was warned. Not threatened loudly, not openly, but enough to understand. They told me if I stayed, he said, you would suffer for it. I felt cold all over. So you ran, I said. No, he corrected gently. I protected you. Samuel explained how he spent years moving from place to place, taking small jobs, gathering information quietly. The letters stopped when he realized they were being watched. Every message I received, he feared, might lead someone back to me. I chose silence, he said, his voice breaking, because silence was safer than love. I wanted to be angry. God knows I tried. But when I looked at him, tired, worn, and standing in front of me at last, anger felt too heavy to carry. Why now? I asked. Why come back after all this time? That was when his eyes filled with fear again. Because the man who framed me is dead, Samuel said. And the truth he buried is about to surface. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin folder, yellowed with age. Inside were documents, old newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, proof, not just of his innocence, but of a crime that had never been solved. They'll reopen the case, he said. And when they do, people will start asking questions. About me, about you. My hands shook as I closed the folder. So you came back to warn me, I said. Yes, he answered. And to finally tell you everything before the world does. The clock on the wall ticked loudly between us. 40 years of silence pressed against my chest, demanding space to breathe. You should have trusted me, I said quietly. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid I'd lose you forever. I looked at the man who had been my husband, and the stranger shaped by years of sacrifice. And for the first time, I realized that his absence had not been empty. It had been full of danger, choices, and love carried at a distance. But one question still burned inside me. If the truth was about to come out, why did I feel like the worst part of this story had not yet begun? The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Sleep had barely touched me. My mind was crowded with memories, questions, and a fear I could not yet name. For 40 years, I had imagined what it would feel like to have Samuel back in my house. I never imagined it would come with the weight of secrets and unfinished business. Samuel was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded, just as he used to. For a moment, I allowed myself to pretend that time had folded in on itself and given us another chance. Then there was a knock at the door. This time, it was not hesitant. It was firm. Samuel and I exchanged a glance. My heart sank. When I opened the door, I found Mrs. Calder, our nearest neighbor, standing stiffly on the porch. Her eyes widened the moment she saw Samuel behind me. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "It's really you." Her voice carried, as voices always do in small towns. By midday, the entire town knew. People I had not seen in years came walking past my house, slowing down just enough to look. Some waved, some stared, some avoided eye contact entirely. I watched them from the window, the same window I had waited by for decades, and realized something strange. They were afraid. Of Samuel. Of the truth. By afternoon, two officials arrived from the county office. They were polite, but careful. They asked Samuel questions they should have asked 40 years ago. I sat beside him, listening as the past was unfolded like an old wound reopened. When they left, Samian said, the next day, a notice appeared in the local paper. The old case was being reviewed. Samuel's name, my husband's name, was printed again. Not as an accusation, but as a question. That single change shifted everything. Some people came to apologize. Others stayed away. A few acted as if they had always believed in him, though I remembered their silence clearly. Then something happened that shook me more than all the whispers combined. A man named Harold Finch came to our door. He had been a close friend of the person who framed Samuel, a man I had always avoided, though I never knew why. Harold's hands shook as he spoke. "I knew," he said quietly. "I knew back then." The words cut deeper than anger ever could. "You watched my husband disappear," I said. "And you said nothing." He lowered his head. "I was afraid." That word again. Fear. Fear had stolen 40 years from us. That night, Samuel and I sat together in silence. The town lights glowed faintly in the distance. I realized that truth does not arrive gently. It pushes its way in, demanding to be acknowledged. "I don't know if I belong here anymore," Samuel said softly. I reached for his hand. "This town made its choice once," I replied. "Now it must live with it." But even as I said those words, a terrible thought crossed my mind. If the truth was coming out, who would it hurt next? By the 4th day, after Samuel's return, the town no longer whispered. It argued. Voices rose in grocery aisles, on sidewalks, and in church pews. People took sides, as if this were a story that belonged to them, not a life that had already been broken once. I watched it all from my front window, the same way I had watched years slip by. That morning, a letter arrived with no return address. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single line written in hurried ink. If the past is opened completely, not everyone will survive the truth. I showed it to Samuel. His face darkened. "They're scared," he said. "That means we're close." Later that afternoon, the county officials returned, this time with a lawyer and a box of old evidence files. They asked to sit at our table, the same table where Samuel once carved my name into the wood when we were young. One of the officials cleared his throat. "There's more to this case than we thought," he said. "Your husband wasn't the only person harmed." They explained that the crime Samuel had been blamed for was part of a larger cover-up. Funds had been stolen, records altered, and more than one respected name in Willow Creek had benefited from his disappearance. My chest tightened. These people, I asked, they still live here? The official hesitated. Some of them, he admitted. That night, Samuel finally told me the one truth he had never written in his letters. There was a child, he said quietly. I turned to him, confused. What child? He swallowed hard. The crime I uncovered. It involved an accident. A boy was hurt. His family was paid to stay silent. I was framed to protect the men responsible. I felt the room tilt. And you carried this alone, I whispered. I had to, he said. If I spoke, you would have been in danger. So would the child. Suddenly, everything made sense. The threats, the silence, the fear that never left Samuel's eyes. The next day, the boy, now a grown man, came forward. His name was Daniel Reed. He stood in front of the town council, his voice steady but heavy with pain, and told them everything. How his family had been warned. How money had changed hands. How one innocent man had been sacrificed, so others could keep their reputations clean. The room fell silent. By evening, arrests were made. Names I had known my entire life were spoken with disbelief and shame. Men who had smiled at me in church now avoided my eyes as they were led away. Samuel squeezed my hand. I didn't come back for revenge, he whispered. I came back so the truth could breathe. That night, I stood alone in the kitchen long after Samuel went to bed. I looked at the walls, the clock, the door he had walked through for days earlier. The town was changing. So was my heart. I had waited 40 years for my husband to return. But I was beginning to understand something painful. Waiting was the easy part. Living with the truth would be much harder. The days after the arrests felt unreal, as if Willow Creek had been shaken awake from a long, uncomfortable sleep. Doors stayed closed. Curtains twitched. People who once spoke freely now chose their words carefully. And inside our house, silence returned, but this time it was different. Samuel was home, yet I felt the weight of 40 years pressing between us. Love does not simply return to its place after being absent for a lifetime. It must be rebuilt, piece by fragile piece. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Samuel spoke the words I had been waiting for and dreading. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. Not for leaving. Not for the years you lost. I stared into the fire. I lost more than years, I replied. I lost a life I never lived. He nodded. I know. That honesty hurt more than excuses ever could. I told him about the nights I cried quietly so the neighbors wouldn't hear. About the holidays spent setting to plates out of habit. About the way hope slowly turned into something heavy and lonely. Samuel listened without interrupting. Tears traced paths down his face. I carried guilt every day, he said. But I thought distance was the price of keeping you alive. And who decided my life was worth living alone? I asked. He had no answer. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a single moment. It is a series of choices made over and over again, even when the heart resists. The town council issued a formal apology to Samuel. His name was cleared publicly. The local paper printed a correction, larger than the original accusation. Hade verban. It helped, but it did not heal everything. One afternoon, a young woman knocked on our door. She introduced herself as Lydia Reed, Daniel's sister. Her voice shook as she thanked Samuel for protecting her brother all those years ago. "You saved us," she said, "even when it cost you everything." After she left, I realized something painful. Samuel had been a hero to others, but to me, he had been an absence. That night, I finally said the words I had been holding back. "I don't know if I can be your wife again," I told him. "Not the way I was before." He looked at me gently. "Then let me earn a new place," he said. "Whatever that may be." We began slowly. Morning walks, shared meals, quiet conversations without expectations. Some days felt hopeful. Others reopened old wounds. But Samuel never rushed me. "I waited 40 years to come home," he said once. "I can wait longer to be forgiven." And somehow, that patience softened something inside me. Forgiveness did not erase the past. It did not give me back my youth or the children we never had. But it allowed me to breathe again. I realized I did not need to forget. I needed to choose whether the rest of my life would be shaped by pain or by truth. And as I watched Samuel tend the garden that had grown wild without him, I understood something quietly powerful. Love, when tested by time, does not return unchanged. It returns humbler. The first winter after Samuel returned was quiet. Snow fell softly on Willow Creek, covering the years of pain in a gentle white blanket. Our house seemed smaller somehow, yet warmer, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment. The moment when two lives could finally begin again, even if they were forever marked by the past. I watched him one morning, kneeling in the garden, planting bulbs that would bloom next spring. His hands were old, his back bent, but there was a calmness about him I had never seen before. I realized then that the man who returned was not the same man who had left. Time had carved him differently, just as it had carved me. "Eleanor," he said softly, without looking up, "do you think we can really be happy again?" I sat beside him on the cold stone bench, watching the snow settle on the roses he had once promised to plant for me. "Happiness," I said slowly, "is not something we reclaim. It's something we choose, every day." He nodded, his eyes meeting mine at last. And in that look, I understood that we had both chosen to live with truth, to carry our scars, and to find the small moments of joy amidst them. Life in Willow Creek began to settle into a new rhythm. People learned to see Samuel differently, saw me with others with regret. But that no longer mattered to me. What mattered was that he was here, and I could finally stop waiting. I started keeping a journal again, the way I did when I was younger. But this Jimmy I wrote not of longing or fear, but of days we shared together, a quiet walk to the river, baking bread with Samuel humming beside me, evenings spent listening to the wind whistle through the old windows. I wrote of forgiveness and patience, of the fragile beauty of second chances. One evening, as the sky turned pink and gold, Samuel took my hand and led me to the front porch. "Do you remember the day I left?" he asked. I nodded, every detail. "And do you remember the promise I made?" I smiled faintly. "You promised to come back." He squeezed my hand gently. And I did. Not perfectly. Not without fear or mistakes. Tight. Tears rolled down my cheeks. 40 years of waiting, 40 years of questions, had led to this simple truth. Love could endure even the longest absence, even the heaviest secret. We sat together, holding hands, letting the cold air and the warmth of our hearts meet. I realized that life had given us something rare, not the life we once imagined, but a life that was ours to choose now. In the quiet, in the present, shaped by the past, but no longer imprisoned by it. And as the first snowflakes of winter settled on our old blue house, I whispered to Samuel, "Welcome home." After all these years. He smiled, and in that smile, I saw not the man who left, but the man who had returned, braver, wiser, and still mine. Some stories do not end with fairy tale perfection. Some end quietly, with the choice to forgive, to trust, and to live fully, even after decades of waiting. And that, my friends, is the story of how a woman waited 40 years for her husband and found not just the truth, but a life worth living once again.